Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome back for another episode of Ranching Reboot, the weekly podcast that is rebooting your thinking about farming, ranching, food systems, and the people that operate them. This is episode 143, and I'm your host, Brian Alexander. You can find me on social media as Red Hills Rancher. Ranching Reboot is made possible through the support of my patrons on patreon.com and my subscribers on Spotify. If you'd like to join the growing ranks of podcast supporters, check out the links in the show notes or check my Linktree link in any social media bio. Since we've all made it through Black Friday, Small Business Saturday, and Cyber Monday, if you're still looking for some last-minute stuff that you need to get by the holidays, check out some of the podcast supporters for last-minute gifts. Like, I don't know, Wild Ass Soap. Soap makes a good gift. CBD makes a good gift. You can find both those at Wild Ass Soap. Beef makes a pretty good gift, especially if you can't get some to any of your friends on the coast. Blue Nest Beef, they've got you covered. Bobo Links, hey, they make a great stocking stuffer. Blue Nest Beef got you covered on that one too. So check those out. Buying something through the links in the show notes gives you a nice little discount, and most offer an additional coupon code on checkout, so be sure to take advantage of that. This week, I'm thrilled to have a very special guest with me, Zach Withers. Zach's journey is as diverse as it is fascinating, starting from a degree in African politics to brewing, agriculture, and cider production. Now he's a pioneering force in regenerative agriculture, passionately working on his own farm. With the vision for a more sustainable and equitable food system, Zach embodies the spirit of innovation and resilience that we celebrate here on Ranching Reboot. So let's welcome Zach and dive into a conversation that's sure to reboot our thinking about agriculture and sustainability. Hey, you want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. And when you want to take your conversations with fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. Best of all, it's totally free with no catch. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today. So Zach Withers, thank you for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. So why don't you get us kicked off and get us running here and give us your 30-second elevator spiel about who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name's Zach Withers. I was born and raised in central New Mexico and grew up on my grandparents' horse ranch. They Polks Arabians. They bred and showed and sold Egyptian Arabian horses, and moved a couple miles up the road when I was maybe in high school, but still spent most of my time hanging out at Grandpa's, and then went to school on the East Coast and got into farming in the Champlain Valley, Vermont, and then came back home 8 years ago. Actually, 8 years ago, like tomorrow, I think. And my brother had just gotten out of the military. My other brother had stayed and taken care of my grandpa. So we decided when my grandpa passed that we were going to all chip in and buy the family farm. And 8 years later, we're mostly focused on heritage breed pork production. So we're breeding about 20 sows, small flock of layers. And recently we've added in some sheep. We've done a little bit of grazing, but we only have about 40 acres. And 75 head of Egyptian Arabian horses for 40 years to really have an impact on your pastures. So it's more about using the animals to try to grow grass than about using grass to try to grow animals. So that's sort of the background, and we can get more into any of that you're interested in.
Oh yeah. There's plenty of rabbits here to chase. So your grandparents showed Arabians, and they raised the Arabian. You said 40 acres.
Originally 50. Grandma wasn't great with finances, so they sold off a couple 5-acre lots to make some balloon payments. Now we got some neighbors down the road, but we're still sitting on about 40 acres and sort of in a mixed sort of at the edge of the Ponderosa Alpine. We're like 7,000 feet, so it's Pinon juniper for the most part, a little bit of Ponderosa, and then we're got mixed grassland, so it's a little bit of a savanna sort of aspect. But yeah, on a good year, 18 inches of precipitation. Most of it comes over the course of a few weeks in the fall. We get the monsoons pretty hard, although that was kind of true growing up. Everything's gotten a little wonky these days. So
Yeah, I think the weather patterns that we grew up with don't exist anymore. It doesn't seem like it anyway.
permanent state of weirdness.
I like that. I like that. So that land's pretty degraded then.
Um, yeah, it's coming back. My grandma, who is sort of the driving force behind all of it, she was a little bit crazy. When she got much older, she ended up taking a tumble off of a horse while she was riding back. I'm pretty sure riding back from the bar, but she broke her leg and ended up losing one of her legs and decided that she just didn't want to deal with people anymore and took the horses and moved to a town called Mountain Air, about an hour south of here. My grandpa bought her some land and set her up a double wide, and she lived down there with one leg, driving her Massey Ferguson tractor around and taking care of her horses. So the land got about 10 years of total rest. Um, and my grandpa would pay somebody to brush hog it every once in a while. So a little bit of, not like total complete rest, but got all the animals off of it for a long while. And then we've been slowly doing intensive grazing and a little bit of compost application and trying to manage it. So we've seen some secession, like there's less bare ground now than there was when we started. It still looks pretty rough, but
What I'm thinking about, like the 10 years that he paid somebody to come bush hog it. Are you noticing any effects from that kind of a treatment, like that treatment long term, year over year? Is that something that you're having to deal with to try to regenerate the land?
I think that the rest with a little bit of mechanical, you know, treatment was actually good. The downside is that I remember growing up, we had like, I mean, the good part about having that many horses and having um, trail, semi truckloads of hay coming on is it's like quite a bit of nitrogen. And so you're feeding a lot into the land, even though you're not really treating the plant communities right. The sunflowers always did really good. So we used to have, 12-foot tall rows of sunflowers along both sides of the road. And the brush hogging kind of knocked some of that back, but they're starting to come back. Um, it's been more interesting sort of watching as we've been grazing it. Like we've had different, I remember seeing like, we call it snakeweed. I think some people call it rabbit brush. It's a pretty invasive and uh, they call it when it kind of kills all the plants around it. That came through.
Allotropic.
Yeah,
Allotropic, I
yeah,
think.
something like that. That came through like 5 years ago, and it just like completely took over all the pastures. And I was like, oh my goodness, we've been trying to like graze these lands to regenerate them for 2 years, and now it's just all turning into this weed. And what are we gonna do? Um, and I like tried to figure out if we could. My previous career was in the spirits world, so I'm like a little still and started trying to make essential oils because apparently these weeds that are considered like a huge problem for rangelands in the West have like 128 known compounds and 60 some odd of them have medicinal properties. So I was trying to make like snake oil. I figured we'd be the pig farmers selling snake oil. Um, but it was interesting. We just, watched, and a couple years later, 90% die off. And I don't
Really?
know why. I don't know why, but just intensive graze, long rest, intensive graze, long rest, and the secession just at some point all the plants just didn't come back, and then now we've got Russian thistle, tumbleweeds, but I'm learning to just not worry about it and realize it's just part of the process, and this is what healing the land looks like. It takes a long time, and
Do you feel like you're moving towards higher succession weeds or forbs? I hate calling them weeds, right? Like, what is a weed?
the
What
plant out of place.
a plant out of place, but if we're talking about a native pasture, how is a plant ever out of place? Because that's what's supposed to be out there is plants. And I get, okay, we can go down a rabbit hole of talking about native versus invasive species. Alan Savory said something, oh, I don't know, probably 10 years ago that I had to think about before it really clicked. And I'll make it make sense. What's the difference between an archaeologist and a grave robber? A couple hundred years.
PhD,
Oh, just time. It's just time. So
couple hundred years, yeah.
the difference between a native and an invasive species is, I mean, every species is invasive to some degree in some environment, right? And
Yeah, I don't like the native invasive dichotomy. Like, what is your management goals? Like, a plant out of place for me in my pastures is something that my animals won't eat. They won't eat Russian thistle. They do actually eat a little bit of rabbit brush. Not like they're not going to take a bunch of it, but the snakeweed has something in it that they'll take a little bit of. So there's a little bit of it left, and I don't consider it a weed anymore. When it was 80% of the pastures and was competing and out competing and killing all the other more palatable species, then I was like, okay, I don't like this, but I just waited and kept doing good management, and it improves. So,
and I think that's part of the point is, yeah, 1 year you might have a quote an undesirable plant or a plant out of place pop up in that paddock. It's maybe not something to worry about. Just keep doing what you're doing to take care of the soil, and don't worry about a specific plant. Take care of the soil, and the soil takes care of the plants. And eventually, if we're doing things right, adding biology, high density, long rest periods with adequate precipitation,
that's the trick.
that's the trick. Adequate precipitation. As long as we're hitting those targets, this year I might have old world blue stem or rabbit brush or snakeweed. Next year it might be completely different just because of something that we do not understand that happened in the ecosystem or the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you almost have to adapt to be comfortable with having a totally different range of plants on a regular basis. Like last couple of years, the timing of the precipitation has really varied a lot. And so I've been seeing plants that I've never seen before popping up. And like, what is this? And what do I do with it? And it looks cool, trying to figure out what it is. And, just the spring rains came really early this year. And then last year they came really late. Opposite. Last year they came really early, and we had one sort of plant community really thrive. And then this year it was like, we called them the Maysoons. We got tons of rain in May, which is kind of late for like spring rains and really early for monsoons. So
Okay.
entirely different. I learned a lot. We did a bunch of compost application and intensive grazing last year, and then tried to rest this year, and ended up with a monoculture of mustard. And it was like, oh, I should have gone back and grazed it again while the mustard was still young and palatable. And didn't do that because I thought maybe the next thing would come up. And, I was like, oh, okay. So now I know, like, that timing of rain, you get these sort of dominant plant communities. The mustard is actually edible for humans when it's really small. It's pretty good. And animals will mow it down hard. But once it seeds out, it's totally unpalatable, and it creates it just shades everything out. So now we're going to do some bale grazing and mowing and stuff to knock that down and incorporate it, and then, try again next year.
Well, it's interesting you brought up, timing of rain when you guys normally get your rains, some in the spring, most in the fall. And I've been really trying to pay attention the last 3 years since the drought got bad and kind of set in, of what my plant recovery was like through different times of the year based on rainfall, or what kind of plants that I've grown more of based on, when the rains came.
And remind me where you're ranching at?
Yeah, I'm in South Central Kansas. So I'm about 20
South Central
miles.
Kansas.
Yeah, I'm like 20 miles from Oklahoma, halfway between Colorado and Missouri.
All right.
So I'm not that far north of you, but quite a ways.
I drove through there recently, and Man, I actually kind of got a soft spot in my heart for Kansas. I think it's a bit of a hidden gem.
Shh, don't tell anybody. I mean,
I shouldn't say that being from New Mexico. I'm like, I tell everybody there's just meth heads and scorpions here. Just stay out. There's no water, bunch of criminals, nothing cool about it.
yeah. So when after Regenerate in Santa Fe, we didn't leave immediately. Like we stayed around the rest of the day and ended up leaving. I think it was we drove home Sunday, and we went up to Taos. I drove up to Taos, my wife and I did, and then we took this big tour around, that north loop around through Red River and back down. And when
Some
you
good
come out of
country.
that, it's just gorgeous. And then you come out of the mountains and you get to this town called Cimarron, New Mexico, and it
Yep.
says the gateway between the mountains and the plains. And they're not lying. You go east of Cimarron, and it was basically flat all the way home.
In cowboy country out there.
Yeah, yeah. But northeast New Mexico, eastern Colorado, western Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma Panhandle. Yeah, we could definitely use some work. There's some pretty spots, and there's some spots that I just kind of chase the white lines and keep right on going.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting though. Like I'd love to hear a little bit like um jumping ahead maybe some where we opened a retail food store a couple years ago, and we've been getting meat from a bunch of other places because we don't produce enough to support even a single retail outlet. Um, and one of the ranches we work with is up in the northeastern part of the state, and really fascinating. Like, gotten to spend a lot of time up there, and there's some other big ranches. Sam and Ariel live right next to the gal that we buy most of our beef from. There's another ranch, Fort Union Ranch, that I've become good friends with the folks up there, and getting to dip my toe a little bit more into the big cattle ranching world and hear about the management challenges and all that stuff. It's really different than running 40 acres, and really mostly we operate on about an acre and a half is what we use for producing hogs, and we produce a lot of meat that way. But it's a very different sort of operation, and I'm really interested in uh, the larger landscape management stuff and some of what you're doing, and the differences between a 100,000 acre ranch and a 7,000 acre ranch versus 40 acres. It's like all the concepts. How do you take the concepts and apply them? You know, in a context sort of appropriate way. That seems to be a major challenge, and um, part of the conversation I'm really fascinated by right now is how you create more like unity in the agricultural world. You have the big guys, the industrial guys, the commodity producers. You got the tree hugging, dirt worshiping hippie farmers, and we're all kind of aimed at the same thing, but the conversations just seem to be really disparate. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. That was meant to be a question.
Okay. Well, I mean that it's interesting to think about, and I spend quite a bit of time thinking about it, and I'm not sure if there ever really can be quote unity between the two sides, and even just kind of framing it that way internally in my head kind of almost feels wrong because I don't want to compete. I don't want I don't want to be in conflict with anybody else that's trying to quote feed the world or just feed their community or feed their family. Okay. But at a certain point, the unity, it's like if we're on the regenerative side of the fence and trying to produce things in a more natural way, without hormones, without antibiotics, without a lot of added grain, just, trying to do everything ourselves and, reduce our outside inputs. The other side of this business, whether we're going to talk about, the totally captured chicken and pork side, or whether we're going to talk about the mostly captured beef side, it's I think we're always going to be looked at, not always, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to continue to be looked at as on the fringe or a niche producer because there's no way that what things like you and I are doing will ever scale up enough to feed the world, right? The quote, feed the world that Earl Butts brought us from Get Big or Get Out. And I, that narrative bothers me because something like 75 to 85% of the world, I've quoted this number before and I was a little off, but 75 to 80% of the world is fed by subsistence farmers on
Mostly
10
women,
yeah, on 10 acres or less.
and almost all farmed by women.
I can believe that. I can definitely believe that. But here, we have a different culture here. We have the cowboy culture from the West and, the romanticism of big ranches. The sad reality is that's not where most cattle come from. I mean, a lot of cattle come from back east. They're raised in, 5, 10, 15, 20 head herds, somebody's backyard that's got a town job.
Yeah.
They
Places
load
where
those,
you count head per acre, not acres per head.
right. And they load those calves up and they send those calves out here to the plains for grass in the summer and then to go to the feedlot and get marketed. Your average cow calf guy has 45 head. Like that's the average size of the cow herd in the United States is like 45 head. Okay. I know some guys that have several thousand. I mean, I could name 5 guys right off the top of my head that live within 20 miles of me that all have more than 1,000 head of cattle.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you think about like how much the regenerative movement tends to talk about like smaller operators, but when you get into like using cattle for trying to do land regeneration, the guys who are having the really, fence line contrast, changing the weather patterns impact on land are all running 800 to 1,000 at least.
Yep. So
at least in like our part of the world where it's really arid, I think you can have that similar impact in places where you get higher precipitation with smaller herds, but it is a bit of a conundrum when you have some of the regenerative parts of the Alan Savory world. At least, Alan Savory is really geared towards, he developed his grazing management techniques while he was operating on 1,000,000+ acres.
Yeah.
So I loved like reading Alan Savory and holistic management was like a watershed moment of like, oh my goodness, this is the first time I've ever read a book that is totally applicable to my context, until I got to like page 200 and something. And there's this little thing that's like, well, this doesn't work that well at a really small scale. It's like 2 cows on 2 acres is very different than 200 cows on 200 acres. It's just, you don't get the same animal impact, the same herd effect. We're trying to figure out how to like get around that. And a lot of that comes back to economics, not so much the the ability of the animals to have the impact. It's about, do you have the time to put into managing the animals in a way that creates that impact and then get paid $300 for doing it. Can't spread your costs out for management across 1,000 animals when you're operating on 40 acres. So like the grazing component of we're not even trying to do grazing as a commercial part of it. It's geared more about education, about just land management, and the commercial part of the operation is all the hogs. They quite literally bring home the bacon. So,
well, I'm still trying to circle around this unity concept.
Well, let me throw something back at you. Maybe it'll help sort of point out like what you were talking about a minute ago with regenerative being based mostly in this idea that we're going to eliminate external outputs. We're going to use the most natural way of using solar cycling. Like if you're running cattle, the cattle are feeding themselves. They're processing the manure into or processing the grass into manure. The manure is feeding the soil, increasing water cycling. All good, right? Like our operation, the last couple of years, we haven't had grazing animals on the place. All of our feed is coming from the outside. We use external inputs to feed all of our animals, and we're not actually connecting back to most of the compost is going towards like helping other people doing market gardening and supplying the affordable compost inputs for people who are doing vegetable production. So like outside of the little bit of grazing, like we don't really fit into what most people think about as a regenerative model. We're not growing crops. We're not, like we do a little bit of grazing, but that's not like a commercial operation. The commercial operation is based about taking byproduct and food waste, things that are considered, I think are undervalued, and then using that to, and using animals to process that into like biological soil amendment, which, methane is what comes out of anaerobic digestion of organic material, like in the landfill, is 25 times the greenhouse gas impact of carbon dioxide.
Can you explain that for people that don't know anaerobic versus aerobic decomposition?
I can try. There's much smarter people than me that could do a much better job of it. But the basic gist is that if you put food in the landfill and then you pack it in and it's not getting oxygen put to it, the way that it breaks down produces. I was just talking with somebody about the actual chemistry here because it's really interesting. It's turning nitrogen into methane, because the organisms that operate in the absence of oxygen produce a different chemical reaction than organisms that are aerobic or have oxygen. So when we take, the food waste, the manures, the whatever, and we take them out and put them into windrows and we turn the piles, we're adding oxygen. We're also adding a lot of carbon. Like we live in an area that is a fire dependent ecosystem that hasn't burned in a century. Ooh. So it's heavily overgrown. And now it's also like suburbia. I mean, I grew up in the country, but now I live in suburbia, and the fire danger for everybody living here is really high. So there's a lot of effort to thin the forest. So we've figured out how to take the wood byproduct, which most of the contractors have to pay to go dump it at the transfer station. And we figured out just give them the gate codes and we get dump truckloads of wood mulch, which put a foot of wood mulch down in the pens, divert a couple million pounds of food waste a year. Animals eat the food waste. It goes into the wood mulch. So the carbon mixed with the nitrogen. And then you make sure that you add water. And most of the reason we keep on picking up food waste is just because we're hauling effectively thousands of gallons of water onto the farm every week. So it really cuts down on how much we have to run our well. And so water, and then use a skid steer to turn it, add oxygen, carbon from the wood mulch, nitrogen from the food waste and the urine and manure. Those things, if they have enough oxygen, will get processed into compost. And it's pretty interesting. We actually had somebody from Los Alamos National Laboratories come out and take a gas spectrometer and read the gas coming off the compost piles, and they were baffled by how little methane was coming off of our compost piles, speculating that the microorganisms inside of the compost piles are actually eating the methane and maybe turning it back into nitrogen, which I don't know. I'm not a scientist, and I'm just maybe misinterpreting something somebody said, and that's the aspiration. But to come back to the point, like what we're doing is a little bit more like a hippy dippy crunchy CAFO. Like all my animals are in pens. All my inputs are external, but we're impacting water cycles. We're impacting, economic cycles around local food, providing, keeping methane out of the air, out of the atmosphere. So like,
well, if you weren't doing what you were doing, there would be more CAFO pork, more CAFO chicken in your local food system, which that's just externalized cost for everybody.
Yeah. But the question of like, how do we create more unity in the food world? Like the logic behind what we're doing actually is not totally dissimilar from some of the things that the big CAFOs do that we call them out for greenwashing, like Smithfield. If you don't know, Smithfield is currently a Chinese-owned corporation.
Yeah.
That controls, I think, almost, depends on who you talk to or what you read, 40 to 60 to 90% of the pork in the U.S. And I've heard that actually the Chinese corporation is not that happy with Smithfield USA, and they're trying to figure out how to separate it back out. And maybe some of that has to do with like Smithfield dropped $500 million into capping manure lagoons to sequester methane and put in the digesters to burn it to produce energy, and are running pipelines to run that, because methane is natural gas.
Right.
So like we can, the new buzzword I've heard is like the sustainable natural gas is like natural gas that's a byproduct of agriculture or some other industry. And I have problems with everything that they're doing, but like some problems, but like it's interesting to think about like how can we shift the whole spectrum instead of trying to push, everybody towards one end of the spectrum. This is the thing that I've been pondering for a while.
Okay. Some of the issue I have with seeing future unity in agriculture is the difference between owner operators like you and me versus a corporate operator. And by that, I mean an outside, when I say corporate operator, okay, that means that management is divorced from ownership. And whether or not labor's on the same layer as management, that's irrelevant. But that's management is divorced from ownership in that kind of a situation, whereas ownership is going to tell management what the goal is rather than management and ownership working together to find a goal. So like people listen a lot, like this kind of review, but I'm kind of unique because I'm not unique. I work for a crazy person. I work for myself. And I also have a crazy person working for me, which is also me. So I wear all three hats. I wear owner, manager, and I wear labor. So I've got to do all the project planning. I got to do the nuts and bolts on the ground. I got to figure out how to pay for it. So when you're just hired, and let's just say Deseret Ranches, and I'm not picking on Deseret Ranches. I think they've got a great system. And maybe they're probably not even the best example because they're actually kind of better than what I'm going to talk about. But say you're managing a ranch for a big corporation, and they come in and they're like, "You're not hitting these performance targets," but you're like, "Hey, but I'm hitting all my land targets. Like this, and this are happening to land." And I said, "Well, but you're not hitting these performance targets. Either hit these targets, or we'll find somebody that will." And now you're in a position where you're going to make a decision that may harm the land near term or long term in order to keep your corporate shareholders happy, your absentee landowner happy, or whatever. And those people, they're insulated from the consequences of their actions. They're insulated from the consequences of the practices that they want you to do on that land. Because I mean, it's awful easy to farm corn from a boardroom in Illinois, right? It's awful easy to raise cows from an office in New York City.
Yeah, or from a penthouse inside of a specially built prison in Brazil. Like half the beef in the world get managed from. JBS.
I was gonna say, you're not talking about Juan Batista and Sons, are you?
No, I think that the JBS brothers make the cartel guys look like a little bit like sissies. I mean, those guys are ruthless. Yeah. And I'm not talking about unity with that part of agriculture. I'm talking about the unity between the cow calf producer that, sells to the feedlot in Kansas, or unity with like, we still grow 90% of the corn is still grown on family owned farms. Corporate agriculture, the corporatization of agriculture, huge problem. But I think that the reason that, the thing I'm worried about is that if we don't figure out how to bridge some of the gaps between, the small family farmer who's mostly conventional and is, sort of bought into the current model, between the guys who are trying to do things differently, who are trying to like internalize the costs, create positive feedback loops, close the nutrient cycles, do all the things that really make agriculture sustainable. If we can't figure out how to get everybody on the same team, then like it makes it so much easier for these big corporate guys to just run the show and dictate everything from a boardroom, get rid of land ownership, like get, consolidate the land base. I mean, there's real problems here. And my last few years of trying to work with other producers and navigate ways through supply chains, the thing that I run into a lot is this, like, well, we don't want change because we are sort of dependent on this existing system. And so if you're coming in and trying to say we need to do things differently, that comes as like a threat to us. And I'm hoping that to see an emergence of a different narrative that talks about how we can actually, you know, call it whatever you want to call it. Regenerative agriculture saves money. It makes operations more sustainable. Like, you don't have to be certified organic. You don't have to be a hippie. You don't have to like be spiritually connected to the soil to know that like managing your soil for soil health will make you more resilient, will make you, the hard times easier and the easy times all that much better. And, so localized, regionalized supply chains means that we shorten the supply chains, more of the retail dollars going back to the actual farmer. And, when we re-internalize the costs of production and market that, people are willing to pay for it. A huge part of the problem we run into is just people pay 5-10% of their income on food, and the farmer, the environment, the animals pay the rest.
Yep.
We need people to be willing to pay 20-30% of their income on food if we're going to be able to fund, keeping food systems viable. Like, I always get so bothered with like this narrative of, sorry, I'm monologuing. Go ahead, jump in there.
It's all right. I got some thoughts on family farms and what they're all about, but I got to take a quick break real quick to
Shoot.
recycle some coffee. So we'll be back in just a minute.
All right.
And we're back. So some thoughts about family-owned farms. And gosh, it's kind of a tough one, because who has a family farm? Everybody does, even Cargill. Like, they're parts of the Cargill Corporation that are classified as a family-owned farm. They can even classify, certain big feedlot systems, like that big Easter Day deal that blew up out in Oregon a couple years ago. Do you remember that Easter Day family?
I don't, but I believe you.
They had a couple hundred. They had like 150,000 head feed yard. That's a family farm.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The guy that used to be the head of NCBA like last year, Don Schiffelbein, they've got it like, they run, I can't remember what he told me, a couple hundred, several tens of thousands of head, and there's like 8 of them involved. Like, okay,
yeah, our Bill Gates 250,000 acres of ag land, is that a family farm? The Gates family?
Yeah. I mean, what about Ted Turner's 2 million acres? Is that a family farm? Is that a family ranch? Like, so when some of these terms get thrown around, like,
It comes back to what the management thing, like you were talking about, ownership being divorced from management. I think that when I use the term family farm, I'm talking about, when the family is directly involved in the management of the farm. Like, for instance, like a kind of funny example of this, the Fort Union Ranch that I was talking about earlier, is owned by the descendants of the Civil War senator that was given the the fort, which is like a historic monument up in northeastern New Mexico. And so there's 400, 500 people who own this 100,000 acre ranch. And there's now, just for I think the first time, there's actually a member of the family managing the ranch. And so it's like, yeah, the term is problematic, but it's still what we're talking about how the divisions in agriculture, and the definitions around what it kind of is on our side versus not on our side.
I think the lines are just too blurry. And when you start drawing lines, and when you start breaking apart groups, okay. I guess what I want to say right now is, You know how to solve racism? Let's take the race box off of every federal form. Like that's the first thing we got to do. So when you identify people as a group, you can start to collect data on them and you can make decisions about that group of people, right? So sometimes those things are a little bit dangerous when we start like othering people or we start grouping people together and say
Yeah.
these people need to change. Like let's just say, hey, as producers and consumers of food, we all need to change.
Yeah. This is exactly the point I was trying to make, is that like I think when we fall into this us them category, it gets harder to like find the things where there's common ground and push on those things. And I think that like arguing about our differences is less important right now than identifying like this idea of the radical center, that if you take two disparate groups who seem to be in opposition to each other and sit them down and uh, get them to actually talk things through, most of the time you find out that like the important things, there's a lot of shared agreement. And like, that's the spirit of the question I was trying to ask.
Okay. I I think that you know I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think there's I think you're right that there's a lot of groups that, let's say, the news media, not me, but the news media classifies as far left or far right. And that's not really true. I think that there's a lot of extreme centrists that are talking about the same things. And the reason that we're not like all to there's two reasons we're not together there in that center. Okay. Guns and abortion. Like those are the two issues that they can keep us completely divided on and keep us arguing about.
Oh, I hate this game so much.
Yeah. So let's not talk about it.
Well, no, we should talk about the reality that like, these are two issues that are intentionally used as a way to manipulate people to create division where there isn't really any, so that you can keep people divided, so that you can control and exploit them. And it doesn't matter what race, it doesn't matter what, like it's the haves and have not. I'm not gonna get too much into politics here, but
it's okay.
bringing
There's
it
an
back to the
election coming up.
agriculture, like, I think about what I'm doing. um we're in a the Sandia sub basin. So we're on the east side of the Sandia Mountains. So we're technically part of the Rio Grande Basin because there's a couple creeks that haven't run in 25 years that theoretically connect us back to the Rio Grande, but there's no way that there's water pipes ever coming up from the city to provide people with water. The groundwater resources where we're at are dropping at 2.5 feet on average because of
Two and a
domestic
half feet.
wells
How often? Like over what time period?
every year.
2.5 feet a year.
Yeah. And it's real complex geology. So there's some places that drop in at 10, 20, 30 feet a year. Some places that are actually coming up. So we got fault lines. The geological survey looks like tie-dye. It's pretty fascinating for me. But the
If
the
my
reality
water
is
well
that my
was dropping,
community,
if my water well was dropping like 2-3 feet a year, I'd move.
everybody in my community will lose access to potable water in the next 25 years, hands down.
What's your
Now,
plan?
the reality of what people are doing to address the situation is building pipelines from the Estancia Basin, which is south and east of us, which is a closed basin that's sitting on a finger that's more like part of the Ogallala. So it's much less complex geology. They're also going down at a foot a year. Now, that is primarily probably 80% of that is from center pivot agriculture. And so when I'm a farmer, I get grouped in with the King's Ranches, which is one family, a family farm that
Yep.
runs
Yeah.
26 center pivots, pumping out. They're not metered, but speculatively, if you're growing an alfalfa crop, 30, 40, might be 3 acre feet per center pivot
Yep.
per year at 160 acres minus the corners, 130 some odd acres times three. That is, hundreds of millions of gallons of water that are being used to grow mostly alfalfa and corn silage to feed the dairy industry in southern New Mexico, which produces the mozzarella in Texas for cheap pizza in New York.
Yep.
And my we're 30 years out from being, the Sandia Basin's probably 20 years. Sansi Basin's, they say 60. The 2016 water plan said 65. You can do the math. They keep on changing the length that you need to prove you have a water supply to build a house lower and lower, so that we can keep building houses even though there's no water to support the people who are already here.
That's a problem for future government.
Yeah. Anyway, what I was trying to get at was that, like, if I'm, according to the rest of the world, I'm a farmer and I'm part of the problem, right?
Yep.
And if I present myself as being somehow other or better than or different from or unwilling to engage with the farmers in my community who really are part of the problem, or try to pretend like farming is not part of the problem, then how are we gonna address, like, the only real option we have for ensuring that future generations will have access to water is figuring out how to reduce extractive groundwater mining to the point where, like, we don't cause subsidization to close off the aquifers and completely. This is where I'm going to try to not cuss a lot, but like, when you suck aquifers dry, they can settle out in a way that prevents them from being able to recharge. So it's not just that we're, like, screwing ourselves over because all the wells run dry. We're interrupting the water cycles in a way that can cause ecological followed by social collapse. And, like, it's easy to talk about this because it's, like, really 6 towns in one little micro basin. It's the same problem for the entire southwestern United States.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm worried that, like, we're going to be arguing about whether or not no-till is better than organic, or if you should be doing set stock and reducing costs to sell to the feedlots, to the the
It's
wheat
not going
fields.
to matter if we don't have enough water to drink.
Yeah, like, we don't have. I don't think we have time to be so exclusive, especially when it's 1.5% of the population is producing all the food. Like, I think we really need to, like, create a narrative that's a little bit less us them, and talks about the principles and talks about economic viability for small independent family farms, whether it's a family farm is, like, 2 people, or it's hippie commune, whatever it is. Like, coming back to what you said, I like that even better. Like, get away from the family farm and talk about, like, land ownership and management being tied together, so that we don't all, like, we're headed back towards, like, a feudal state. It's crazy.
Yeah, we are. And I actually read a bit of I can't remember where I read this, but it was an article that kind of seemed to indicate it was in response to somebody talking about how land ownership and ranching was being corporatized. And this article seemed to suggest it's always been that way to some degree in this country. Like, that there were groups that, that there were businessmen that would raise money to come out here to the plains and buy a ranch and have somebody manage it for them.
100%.
That
Capitalism.
kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, that's been happening forever. But getting back to unity and creating, we need to create a culture of land stewardship.
Exactly.
Instead of a culture of land ownership and having dominion over the land and remaking it into what we see fit according to our flawed vision. So
reconceptualize the concept of ownership in a context that isn't just exclusively based in private property rights. Like, a real theory of natural rights has to include both communal rights and, it's not talked about quite as explicitly, but it's sort of implied underneath that is what I might call, like, natural rights. Like, in my instance, I have a right to use my well. Like, I own property, I have a well, I have legal right to pump water out of the ground. My neighbors also have that right to have access to water. And if we all don't collectively realize that there's a natural limit to how much water you can pump out of the ground before you kill your aquifer, then the rights of nature will assert themselves by collapsing the aquifer and leaving us all without an access to potable water. So like, can we associate ownership with not just entitlement but responsibility? If you own land, it's not just that you get to do whatever you want with it. So you're responsible for making sure that what you're doing on your land isn't negatively impacting either the community or the greater ecosystem that generates the food, the water, the air, everything that everybody, including us, depend upon.
It's a great idea, and I fully support it. And I've had these thoughts all myself. But
Yeah,
where
go talk to a Senate hearing community about that and you get laughed out of the room.
and that's
I
where
mean, less
everything.
so now. Less so now. I think even the powers that be are starting to catch on. Like, when I heard Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, gave a talk last year at the National Farmers Union Convention, and it was fascinating to hear like him talking about things like nutrient cycling and closed circuit, local economy, and how the importance of local and regional agriculture and redundancy and all this other stuff. It was also really weird and dystopic to hear him in the same sentence talk about competitive advantage in global commodity marketplaces and ensuring that we're aggressively expanding access for American commodity producers into foreign markets, and the whole like food as a geopolitical weapon nonsense right after he's talking about like saving the family farm and building local economy. Is like, man, this is weird, but at least it's part of the conversation now.
Yeah, yeah. I want to circle back to water because I'm not
Oh, please do.
now. My frame of reference for the whole water rights, irrigation discussion, just I don't have a dog in the fight. Okay, I don't have an irrigation well. My creeks are spring fed, so the ranch sits at the top of the watershed. Okay, almost all of it flows north into one watershed. I've got just a little bit that goes south and a little bit that goes east into another creek. But for the most part, I'd say probably 75% of my ranch all drains north through two creeks. So I'm at the top of the watershed. Like, I know what elevation my creeks are at. I know where I can go when I can find water. Like if I drill a well and I get 10 gallons a minute here, that's a pretty decent well, which is good enough for me because that's all 10 gallons a minute's enough to water cows out of. So when I'm talking about water and water rights, I just want everybody to understand that's where I'm coming from. Okay. I have friends 20, 30 miles away that irrigate, that are in a water management district, for something called the Rattlesnake, which goes up to Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, if anybody cares. I've known people that are on that water management board and talked to them. I've talked to a lot of people that are, out west and get irrigation water out of the Colorado River Basin, whether it's upper or lower. Nobody really wants to talk on record about it, and that's fine. There's it's one of those huge complex problems, kind of like we were just, like we've been talking about for the last, I don't know, 20 minutes. You know, yes, I have a right to use the water that's on my land. I have a right to use some of the water that runs through my land. My neighbor also has a right to that water that's coming down the creek. Okay. I have a duty to my neighbor to not screw up that water, to not pollute that water, because his cattle need to use it just as much as mine do. So when I start, so when I kind of start thinking about like irrigation in the Colorado River Basin, okay, unlimited pumping, or we've got this senior water right that goes back however many years that we can use all these acre feet of water. There's no incentives to use them efficiently. There's no buyback if
The
they,
opposite.
yeah, there's no buy. Yeah, they're incentivized to use all of it they possibly can as cheaply as they can in an inefficient manner. Like, that's the reality of it. And if you don't use your full allocation because you've made efficiency improvements and upgrades, well, they'll just cut your allocation for next year. And nobody wants that. So nobody invests in. So that's why there's not a lot of investments in efficiency upgrades or more responsible water usage. And, no matter where you go up and down Colorado River Basin in irrigation, everybody's just trying to do the same thing. I'm just trying to grow some crops. I'm just trying to grow some cows. I'm just trying to feed the world. I'm just trying to make a living. And all those decisions, when viewed at the individual scale, are fine and they make sense. But then when you take all those decisions and you lump them together and see what effect that's causing on the environment, that's bad. But I have absolutely no earthly idea on how to unwind the water rights mess that is the Colorado River Basin. I just know that it's going to be bad. And the Ogallala Aquifer and the High Plains
Yeah, I was going to
aquifers and
bring
the
that up.
irrigation on the plains, we're no different. Like it is no different. There's no incentive structure to use less water, be more efficient, or to keep it in the ground. And
I don't think the lawyers are going to get it sorted out in the next 3 years, you know?
no.
No, and I think while there's these big problems, I think I like to always try to focus my energies, especially when it comes to like politics, into something where there is potential for real impact. Global problems, local solutions. Like the solution to the interstate stream compact isn't going to get sorted out by a bunch of water bureaucrats and water lawyers in Denver and LA and Phoenix, like arguing with each other. Like look at something like the San Luis Valley. San Luis Valley has an amazing aquifer underneath it, overdrafting it to an extreme degree. And they've set up like these local water districts that are 5 or 6 years in, maybe even 10 years in now, but trying to figure out how you get water governance to at a local level. Like in New Mexico, we have a lot of acequias, and the acequia model is like
what's that?
An acequia is a ditch. It's the Arabic word for ditch that was imported with Spain back in the day.
Okay.
And some of the acequias are actually ditches that were built by indigenous people before the Spanish even showed up. It's basically diverting water out of a surface river to feed irrigated land. But there's a governance model around how ditches are managed that is really fascinating and is totally the opposite of what the sort of top-down interstate stream compact approach is. And it's based on an adaptive approach to communal management of a vital resource everybody is dependent upon. It's hard now because like we've re-plumbed the entire Western United States originally to the end of producing power so we can make aluminum to bomb the Nazis. But the long-term impacts of that are that we have half the produce in the country coming out of 2 counties in the middle of a desert in southern Colorado, and like mega alfalfa farms in Scottsdale exporting alfalfa to feed the Saudi Arabian dairy industry. Like that shit is so crazy. It's sometimes interesting and often infuriating to try to have conversations about how you deal with that sort of level thing. And I've been having those conversations recently with a bunch of different farmers because I do a lot with the farmers union, and trying to generate policy recommendations around that stuff is hard. But I think the real solutions are like they have to address not only the demand side, but we have to think about the supply. Like everybody's like, oh, well, we're gonna invest billions of dollars into using nuclear power to do desalination to whatever. It's like we actually have this amazing nuclear generator producing unlimited amounts of free energy that desalinates the entire oceans all the time and then transports the water in these like incredible global transportation veins through clouds. And then we have this like really cool biotechnology we can use to actually influence the way that the surface temperature interacts with the air pressure to cause rain. And those are called plants. And like then we have these arteries that recirculate all of the water through these really cool things called streams and rivers, and like the aquifer systems that feed back into those streams and create surpluses for long-term security. And like none of that's even part of the conversation. It's like, let's build dams and put pipes and concrete and get a bunch of engineers involved. Like the engineers are going to be able to do better than billions of years of evolution. Like you guys are smoking something. Like I think the real solutions are when people start taking care of their soils and there's more plants growing and we're sequestering carbon while cooling the surface of the earth in a way that causes more rain to fall. And then that rain is absorbed into the topsoil, filters down into the aquifers, recharges the streams flow into the rivers. Let's get the chemicals out of the rivers so that the riparian zones can rehabilitate. Let's use animals to improve the health of the riparian zones by either mimicking predators with the use of fences and dogs and cowboys, or like actually get predators back in there to move all the animals around and like make the supply side of the water equation like come back to life. So it's my hopeful, maybe pie in the sky dream of how to address these things. But
I think the only dams that should be built anymore are beaver dam analogs.
Yeah, one rock, damn it.
Yep. I, I have 2 beaver colonies on the ranch.
Oh, that's awesome.
And they're both on the same creek. And as dry as it was back in May, so we were dealing with the drought like everybody else in the plains in the Southwest. But for us, it started raining for y'all about beginning early May, right?
This year, yeah.
Yeah. Some friends in Western Kansas, they said about the same thing. Mine didn't come till the end of May. And I was down there at my beaver ponds a week before it started raining. And I couldn't tell we were in a drought. I couldn't tell it hadn't rained in 9 months. Like the creek was full. There was water going over the dam. There was all kinds of green plants down there. I mean, it was just a little narrow strip of green right down the creek, but that was it. Creek on the west side that does not have beavers in it, but I still need to go get rid of some trees off that creek. It wasn't doing quite as good. It kind of quit running, but I like to go to the mountains. I mean, who doesn't like to go to the mountains? It's only 8-9 hours away to the San Juans, like Ouray, Telluride, Silverton. I just sold my Jeep. I had a Jeep Rubicon, and
did you have the diesel?
No, I didn't have a diesel. When I bought mine, they didn't have the diesel. I think they didn't come out with the diesel till 19 or 20, and I got one of the first 18s.
Well, you dodged a bullet. I had a buddy who had one, and he said it was not that great.
I had a friend of mine got one a year or two after in a Ram 1500. And I know it spent quite a bit of time in the shop for the first 2 or 3 years of its life, but since then it's been a fairly reliable vehicle.
Dodge.
I'm a Dodge guy. Like you walk outside and there's like 4 of them out in the yard. So
yeah.
I know what I'm getting.
Anyway, mountains. I'm going to start talking about trucks. It's probably not.
No, one of my favorite things to do. I mean, and we took that Jeep out there every summer 3 years in a row. Didn't make it out there this year. But it amazed me. The first year we went out there, didn't hardly see any beaver dams. And then you start looking. In the last couple of years we went out there, it's like, there's more beaver out here. This is cool. And then you start to kind of get an eye to look and be like, this is good beaver habitat. There should be beavers here. And then you come back a year later and there's beaver dams there.
Yeah. It is mind-boggling to think about how this fad in European aristocratic, like high society, the ecological impacts of people thinking it was cool to wear a beaver on their head 300 years ago completely changed the entire hydrology of North America. And like, there's still government programs for going out and removing beavers. I'm like, man, that is crazy. Like, we should get beavers everywhere. It is how you slow water in a way that like feeds the system. It's the health of everything is related to controlling the temperature of water. The temperature of water is related to the flow mechanisms. And there's a guy named I'm blanking on it now. Victor Schauberg wrote a book called Our Senseless Toil, which was never published. He's an Austrian forester from like 100 years ago that I've been nerding out on pretty hard. And it's like changed the way I think about water cycles a lot.
I don't think that we will ever understand how bad we broke the hydrology of North America when we killed all the beavers. When we started killing the beavers 300 years ago for the beaver hat craze, it's in the early 1800s.
I think the thing that'll make people understand it is when, ranchers and farmers start paying the government to put beavers back on their farms. And then when we give it a decade after that and people start to see, holy shit, like that's how that's supposed to work. Okay. So maybe we reduce the amount of land that we're cultivating by 20%, but every problem we've had that we've been trying to find patchwork fixes for as a result of this fence line to fence line, take out all the beavers, clear all the land, maximize extraction mentality. When we go, if we can get back to a place where it's let nature do most of the work for us and we're just the stewards who are just observing and making little tweaks to try to accommodate what we want to get out of it, without taking so much that it's constantly requiring us putting more and more and more and more back into it, then people will start to appreciate that more.
I was sitting here thinking about, okay, what sort of legal protection could come from the government? And yeah, I know that sounds really weird for me to be talking about a solution coming from government for a problem that anybody has as a viable alternative. Um, I'm just thinking, what would happen if the government said, beavers are now a protected species. You're not allowed to kill one. If one is a nuisance, you're required to relocate it.
I I don't want to oppose anything that might be part of a solution. I also think that prohibitions never work. And if you tell farmers that they can't do something,
They're going to do it
they're going to
anyway.
say, yeah, sure, boy. So,
Yep.
I think like a cultural shift around like getting and being able to demonstrate to more people how having healthy riparian areas means that you have more water for your livestock, means that there is more, wildlife habitat that helps deal with integrated pest management. If you have birds are the sign of the canary in the mine. Like if your birds are doing good, the land is doing good. If your bees are doing good, the land is doing good. What do they need? They need places, they need habitat. Where's a lot of that habitat? It's near the water. All right, like what do beavers do? They create habitat near water. you know and so if you can get that sort of circular thinking and get away from this linear, how do we extract the maximum out of what we have and turn it into money, which is sort of the driving mentality behind everything, and start thinking about how do we create sort of we're in a mode of like entropy where things are just kind of moving in a not terribly great direction, like shifting into like syntropy, where instead of a linear direction into the shit show, we're in a circular direction, kind of going up and everything, like working together in a way that creates positive feedback loops instead of negative feedback loops. Once you can demonstrate that, people catch on. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that with like old school good old boys being like, no, this whatever you want to call it, regenerative stuff, like I don't have to buy fertilizer, I don't have to do that, I don't have to do that. Yeah, okay, I'll grow the cover crops. Birds are good. If I put in some bushes next to the field, then I don't get as much dust blowing at my house, and my wife likes the songbirds. Like, all right, yeah, sure, and I'll get an NRCS grant for it. Yeah, get on board. And then the more the mainstream picks up that sort of like, okay, like this isn't crazy. This is how we've been producing food for the 10,000 years before the last 75 years when the government got involved. Um, Sorry, another rant.
No, 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 that's fine. That's fine. Before the government got involved, I mean, I don't think I'd say we had an efficient functioning food system before the government got involved. There's a lot of waste. And I think that there's always going to be waste in a food system. And
Oh
a
man.
quote just surfaced in my mind. A conversation I was having with my wife yesterday. It's being able to accept less than perfect as a result. And I think that's something that a lot of folks in regenerative agriculture would have in common. We're okay to accept a result of less than perfect or less than what we thought it would be, as long as it's moving in the right direction. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, and I have a fun little uh so I got to hang out a little bit last weekend with my friend Roy Foltzcraft, who I think you've spoken with before,
Yes.
and
Yes.
we're hanging out at the Irish pub after the convention, and he was telling us that he's got a new crop he's working on, and he's got some sort of rice. He's trying to dryland farm rice in northeastern Colorado, which gets a lot of funny looks from the neighbors. And if you guys don't know Roy, he's a conventional but very regenerative dryland grain farmer, way out in the sticks, like almost to Nevada. But I think he had 4-6 inches a year of precipitation last year. He's grown 10 different crops. So he got this rice and he grew 5 acres of it. And he was telling us all about it. He had to go to this crazy guy's house and in California, and they didn't want to let him export the seed. So it was kind of like hush hush. And then he got it and he grew 5 acres and total failure. Like amaranth, just a foot and a half tall. If you dug down through the amaranth, there was like a little bit of sprouts of the rice plants. I was like, oh, so you think you're gonna try that again? And he's like, oh hell yeah, I'm doing 15 acres this year. And as like that mentality of like, failure is not really failure. It's just an opportunity to learn. And everything in agriculture is about like in regenerative agriculture, especially like pushing the envelope a little bit, seeing how much you can nudge things into a different direction, knowing that half the time it's not gonna work, and you're gonna have to learn and learn again. So,
Did you know that FAIL is an acronym?
I didn't.
First attempt in learning.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah. So just reframe that. Everybody reframe that in your head. FAIL is an acronym. First attempt in learning.
Yeah, like nothing that we're doing today on this farm is anything that we would have thought we were going to be doing 8 years ago when we started. The whole business plan has changed. Everything has changed.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, we've been talking for over an hour and haven't really talked about anything important yet. So where'd you go to college?
Champlain Valley was a school called Middlebury.
Middlebury,
Don't
Connecticut?
no, that's in Vermont in the
Vermont.
Champlain Valley. It's a little liberal arts school.
Okay. I actually, you're the second person I know that went to Middlebury. We'll talk after about the other one. So what did
I
you
was gonna say, don't judge me. I did not enjoy the majority of the people I went to school with. But I won't get into that. It's a good school. I got a good education.
um what was your degree in?
African politics. My degree actually says international studies with a disciplinary focus in political science, a regional focus in Africa, and a linguistic focus in French. But I usually just say African politics.
Interesting. Okay, so you went from there to the world of brewing.
Spirits first. I got a job at a company called Whistle Pig, which was a little town called Shoreham, which is about 15 minutes from where I went to school. One of my buddies from college, guy I played rugby with, was the first intern. So he got me a spot as the second intern. And that's also how I got into agriculture. The company was based on a derelict dairy farm. And having grown up on a horse ranch and done some landscaping, I was considered the most qualified person to develop the farm operation, which was kind of a joke because there was like a handful of locals that grew up in farming and had managed farms, but I had a college degree, so they put me in charge. So I got to learn by trying to. It was actually pretty interesting because I was in charge, but I didn't know what I was doing. So I had to go to the folks that were supposed to be working for me and say, can you teach me? Can you like show me what I'm doing? And we developed the farm as basically a marketing front for selling imported Canadian bootleg. Well, not bootleg. It was actually at one point it kind of was bootleg, but I, I don't. Yeah,
Okay. You'll have to tell me that story some other time.
yeah. There's a lot of really crazy stories there.
So let tell me how you got from making spirits and bootleg and shine down from Canada to having a to having your butcher shop. How'd that happen?
Um, so working on the farm, we were, uh, I started reading guys like Joel Salatin, Wes Jackson, like Gene Lawson, just got really into like agrarianism. Partially because like, studying, I spent basically 5, 6 years really delving into the question of like, why do people kill each other? Like, why do we as a species like intentionally deprive other populations of our own species of access to resources to the end of annihilating them? And like why, like these sort of basic questions of like what is the driving force behind um, politics and behind conflict and war and genocide and all these like terrible things. And the only thing that and this is not something they'll tell you at school, everybody, this was my own conclusion, that it always comes back to land. And land is not just a resource, but it's like a spiritual concept, and it's deeply connected to water. Um, and so that realization, that was as close as I could get to before I was like, I just don't want to study about this stuff anymore. I want to start transitioning towards like, what am I going to do about it? So agriculture was like the art of managing land, of stewarding land. So that was where that sort of interest grew up out of. So I developed a vision around like, basically had a guy with billions of dollars, this crazy half Irish, half Indian entrepreneur dude, gave me carte blanche to design the supermodel of regenerative agriculture that was going to revitalize local economies and bring back the great American nation. And we were going to do a bus tour around the country to tell everybody about it. And it was a 23 pretty heady time. Um, so I got to we got cattle, we started doing rotational grazing. I was designing crop rotations, hiring, custom workers to come in and grow different, we're trying to grow rye to make rye whiskey. But you can't just grow rye. And so started engaging with the local agricultural community more. And at some point that ended in a $2.5 million of legal fees lawsuit between the board and the owner that I got subpoenaed by both sides and left. And it was toxic and corporate takeover. And they still just import Canadian whiskey, even though they're now growing the rye and they have all the stuff they bring, yada, yada. So I left. I got a job at a distillery that was actually making whiskey, worked, ended up going back and having one of my buddies at the distillery load up some of the grain that I had grown that was just rotting in a barn. Because the new guy was like, I will not sell you this grain. I'd rather it rot and go bad than let one of my competitors have it. And it was like, you're a dick, Jeff. So, so I got some of it anyways. We made some whiskey, worked there for a couple of years. Was doing a cool project with like collaborating with another business next door that was doing sunflower oil production. And they were looking for people to grow sunflowers. I was looking for people to grow rye. I had a friend who had a farm that was trying to do, regenerative stuff. So we designed like this crop rotation, and then where they would do like sunflowers. They did a lot of bees. We would grow rye in the winter. They were contracting with some folks to come in and graze it. Really cool experimental. Like I didn't know what I was doing, but I learned a lot. That ended up kind of going away. The owner of the distillery we had some differences, so it ended well, but kind of moved on to the next thing. Went from there to cider production. There was a company that was trying to use like uncultivated apples to do more like old school, old world hard cider. So I spent a while I'd worked with them like seasonally for a few years because we were neighbors. We actually met when I was working at the whiskey company, and I got to go on a tour of all the cider regions in the world with them. To they were importing cider, but then they also wanted to make their own. So I helped with the exploratory part for the imports, and then went around and did the Lost Apple Project, where we'd find the cool varieties of apples that were kind of forgotten and use them to make like really, really good cider. Um, and then just got to the point of being like, I'm done living on the East Coast. There's too many people here. That was right around the same time that my grandpa was house-ridden or housebound and then bedridden. So I was going back to help my brother and my mom take care of my grandpa. Um, my older brother was in Afghanistan at that point. He got back, got a discharge honorably, and grandpa passed away and said, let's go for it. So bought out my aunts and uncles and started. I think the first year we did row crops and quarter acre row crops and a quarter acre of mixed vegetables. And we planted a half acre of, apples and peach trees. And we had chickens and ducks and turkeys and cows and sheep and pigs. And we had 12 people living on the farm, bunch of volunteers, like, staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning every night with big bonfires and like really awesome, like really great time. And then like year two, it's like, okay,
sounds like
what are we doing? Yeah. And so like within 2 years, it was like pigs and chickens, that's it. And then the really dialed in on the pigs, and that sort of has gone through a whole bunch of iterations. Started out buying shoats, buying like wiener pigs from a farm about an hour south of us, and we were thinking just to finish them out. We had a guy who had a sausage making company, so we were operating under his license. So we're running a sausage cart. We were taking our pigs into a USDA plant, and then having this other guy turn them into sausage, which is also how I got into butchering, because it turns out most people have never seen a carcass before in the meat industry. So that shut down. Couldn't get a kitchen in our area set up because of zoning issues. Had to go to the farmers market model. Ran into a bunch of problems with USDA access for processing. Ended up hauling hogs to Colorado every week for like 2-3 years. Started trying to figure that out. Got a kitchen, got a guy that would slaughter animals under inspection, but wouldn't process them. So we set up our own kitchen. They wouldn't approve the kitchen because we didn't have a retail component. So we built the retail component, and then now we're trying to expand it, and they don't want to allow us to expand because apparently meat's not food according to my county government. Go figure.
Man, that sounds like a mess.
Oh yeah.
So, man, it sounds like government just doesn't want you to sell any food. It just sounds like they're just trying to keep. What's the deal? Why are there so many roadblocks, or is it just stupid local ordinances?
Well, the stuff that we're running into is all very local. We live, I think I mentioned that I might have grown up in the country, but I now live in suburbia. Like, this is the hottest real estate development zone in the state right now.
But you didn't move, just towns grew around.
Albuquerque's like 30 minutes away. And Albuquerque currently has crime levels similar to like Detroit, Baltimore, third world country stuff almost. It's pretty gnarly. So a lot of people were trying to get out of the city, but all the jobs are in the city because they don't like to permit any businesses happening. They prefer to have like sleeper bedroom communities out in the countryside. So there's a lot of, I run a commercial hog farm in an area where they would like to see a house on every 2 acres, and people are currently paying, $500,000 for like a 3-bedroom on 2 acres out here. It's insane.
From the city manager point of view, like having all residential and a few shops, that's ideal. You don't have to deal with dirty industry. You don't have to deal with the pollution, the waste. You don't have to make sure everybody has a job because they're driving back to Albuquerque or into Santa Fe to their yuppie filing cabinet for their job, or they're sitting at home doing it on Zoom like we're doing now.
Yep.
Yeah, that's they're looking at the 30,000 foot view. And if you talk to them privately one-on-one about local food and about what you wanted to do and about how you're feeding your neighbors and feeding your community, they'd be 100% supportive in private on one-on-one. But get them in that budget meeting. We need more tax revenue. We need to increase growth in this area. We're only growing 2%.
And I'd like to start with saying that when I talk about the government, there I have like a deep level of hatred, and I despise it. I'm also friends with a lot of people in the government because I have to deal with them all the time. And like, that's true at county, state, and federal level. My biggest allies in this whole thing have been the Food Safety Inspection Service enforcement guys, who are the meat police, who are responsible for the situation we are in when it comes to meat processing, but they're the guys who have helped us out more than anybody else along the way. So there's some tension there. Like at the county level, there's folks that like are really pushing, and like our current commissioner, we just got raw milk and ungraded eggs legalized for sale in the county, and they are pushing for like doing ecosystem management on riparian areas, and there's a lot of really good things happening. So I have to say that, while also then saying that like the county government is my like the epitome of what is evil about government. It's like, we are going to take your money and then we are going to impose rules that deprive you of all of your basic liberties, so that a handful of people who don't even live here can make exorbitant amounts of profit. And we don't give a shit about what happens after we're done. Like, we're here to make sure that we extract the most out of you and your community as possible, and colonize and just destroy what's good about the place you live in, so that people can make money. And it pisses me off, But that's just the county government. Then you go up one level, like the state level, trying to get the state meat inspection program back online, because we lost 90+% of the inspected processing capacity in the state when the Fed shut down the state meat program in 2007. That has been a 2.5 year debacle, which again highlights sort of the, like, literally they funded it 2 years ago. They developed a good program, but they can't get that legislation passed because one dude on the committee slept with the other dude's wife, and he's pissed about it. So he's, torpedoed the program just in spiteful small town politics nonsense.
What?
It's fun. But to come back to your question about why the government doesn't want us to sell food, like, I'm going to focus in on the federal meat inspection, because that's what I know the most about and understand, I think, some of the reasons for why it is the way it is. When we switched from the prioritizing sort of food security to what people refer to as cheap food policies, the difference between the quote unquote efficiency at the little slaughterhouse where we take our animals versus, I think Kansas is more like national beef, right? Like the big meat packer plants out there process 5,000 head a day.
Yeah, the big plants out here in Western Kansas are like 4,000 to 6,000 a day. I know the big one out at Holcomb that I drive by probably the most often. I think IBP built that back in the 90s, and it's a Tyson bought him out. I think they run 6,100 a day.
Yeah, it's 20 hours.
Yeah,
you got 353-foot reefer trailers in the parking lot that come and go every day. So there's this idea that by embracing this model, it's more, air quotes, efficient, because you eliminate the labor costs. Everything is highly automated, highly capitalized. You, instead of $1 per pound or $2 per pound or $4 per pound for the processing, it's 3 cents, 7 cents, which enable, like, so there's a couple of things that go into it. One, everybody loves cheap food. This is a political reality that goes back to the Romans. Bread and circuses. Give people cheap food, you maintain political power. If you don't give people cheap food, it's hard to maintain political power. That's a tough one to get past. Secondarily, post even going back to World War One, there's a big push on using food as a form of soft power. So when you can export food to another country and you make another country dependent on cheap food that you're producing and then flooding their markets with, they can't do anything that'll piss you off because you can say, oh, well, we control your food supply.
Yeah.
So it works both at a domestic level by controlling the food supply, you control people. International level, same thing. The way to do that is by, they say, reducing, I would say externalizing costs. And so we've embraced wholesale this like corporate commodity globalized food system. So the meat processing world, the rules that they rolled out, which is called the HACCP program, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Plan, something like that, is designed by these big meat processing plants. It gives them the flexibility to be able to do what they need to do to eliminate costs and maximize efficiency, while having this customized food safety plan that then gets reviewed by the federal government, and they determine whether or not it is sufficient to ensure that the food is being processed safely. So they say, this is the system we're going to use for governing food safety around meat processing. And when they rolled that out, they said uniform enforcement. Everybody's going to it. One size fits all. You're responsible for designing your own food safety plan that we can then either approve or deny. We don't have to tell you why we deny it if we do. There's no clear written, like, this is what you have to do. There's 9 categories that you have to address. But it's sort of a, so the way that
we're not going to tell you how to do it, but if you get it wrong, we're going to screw you on it pretty bad.
It's the bring me a rock. Like, you keep bringing me rocks until I say that one works. And I mean, I've worked with, there was a guy who worked at Food Safety Inspection Services, which is the part of the USDA that oversees the program, who quit in protest because he would just got sick of having the sort of political pressure to use this mechanism to put people out of business. And it's the idea that if the small independent guys are bad, they're not safe, it's inefficient, because if you have to send an inspector to a plant that processes 4 head versus a plant that processes 6,000 head, it's a waste of public resources. We just don't need these small processing plants. And I think that there's the government part. I think a lot of it is actually driven by consumers and a cultural shift that says we don't want to deal with mortality. We don't want to deal with death. We want to separate. We don't want to see carcasses. We want everything clean and wrapped in plastic, and not be reminded on a daily basis that we too will also die. I think that's sort of some of the psychology underneath it, but the actual regulatory mechanism that has pushed this consolidation is this, this food safety again in air quotes. It's really about facilitating corporate production, commodity production, to make sure that we are competitive in a global marketplace and that we're exercising global dominance. And then also making sure that people don't have the ability to be independent and provide what they need, because independent people that don't need the government aren't subservient to the government and keep the government in check from being able to fully accomplish the agenda of their corporate sponsors. Is, not to get too conspiratorial on it, but that's sort of the way I see it.
Well, I mean, politics is food, food is politics to a certain extent. If you if you give the people cheap food, they're going to keep, that political party or this government kept food cheap. We're going to keep them in power so we don't have to spend as much on food. And, we're talking about, trying to localize food systems and shorten supply chains. The more we do that, the more it hurts corporate profits. The more it hurts corporate profits, the more they're going to want to pay their lobbyists to shut us down, so they recapture that whole circular profit. Externalizing costs, okay, great. You know, let's just continue down this road and put all of our animals in feedlots and haul them alfalfa, corn, and soybeans. Great. That's fine. And let's do that all with diverted Colorado River water, or we're going to pump our aquifers dry to do that, because we got to feed the world. Food has to be cheap. And everybody that's involved in the current system is making so much money off doing it. I say making money off doing it.
I wouldn't say everybody. There's like a handful of people who are making all the money.
Right. And the handful of people that are making all the money, they don't ever put farmer in their job description title when they're filling out a block on something, right? Like, these are the guy who's making the money. Where does all the federal subsidy money end up that goes to crop insurance, that goes to any crop programs? It doesn't go to farmers. There's no farmer or rancher getting wealthy off government subsidies. We are pass-through agents. Most of us are on leased land, and we are pass-through agents for federal subsidies to go enrich the big ag chemical corporations and the big seed corporations.
Or the banks that underwrite the policies that got sold as the low interest loans to make sure you can keep farming, that you now pay all of your money to.
Yep. And, because we got to have this, because we all had to get bigger, get out. We had to go to the bank and get more land. We had to go to the bank and get more money.
So $2.5 million of equipment.
Yeah. Yeah. So now and now they're stuck in a situation where it's hard for them. It's hard for an operator to change right now that's got a big bank load against him, that's been farming the same way for 20 years, that's on at least 50% leased land with absentee owners. Maybe they're on a cash rent or a share crop basis. You go convince a landowner in Chicago that's owned 160 acres of farm ground and a family deal with like 6 other people. Go tell them that you're not going to raise 240 bushel corn next year, that you're going to plant cover crops. They're going to tell you you're nuts, and they're going to take it away from you and give it to another guy that's going to continue to do the same thing. So as long as food stays cheap and corporations can continue to externalize costs, the government gets to provide people with cheap food, all the while we're feeding this, I hate to say circular economy, but it is kind of circular, right? We eat crap food that makes us sick, so we go get health care and get perpetual treatment for the chronic conditions that are caused by the crap food that we eat.
Oh, man. Yeah, now we're getting into it. Well, before we go down that rabbit hole, which I really want to go down, because I think food is medicine, and like it's been really eye-opening moving beyond our own operation into sort of middlemaning for a couple hundred other people, how much like food changes people's lives. Like the reason that I'm still going at this point is there's like a couple hundred, no, maybe there's like a couple dozen people that buy all the food from the store that we run. And, every time I think like I've had it, I'm done with this, I'm like, I can't take this shit anymore. Somebody comes in and is like, you saved my life, right? I'm like, damn it. Okay. All right. I'm going to go keep working on figuring out an option for USDA inspected slaughter so we can keep going. And, but I wanted to come back to something you said earlier. It's actually said several times. This idea that corporate agriculture feeds the world, and that regenerative agriculture will never be able to feed the world. Like, it's so fascinating to me. There's so many assumptions in here. One, that industrial corporate commodity agriculture can feed the world. Like, I would call that into question right now. We provide enough caloric input for people, but we're not providing, globally, we don't actually produce the nutritional content we need to keep people healthy and alive.
I,
Caloric input to keep you alive, but like there's not nutritional value to actually keep people from dying in mass and like from preventable things. So
we
already
live
there.
in the absolute most absurd time in human history to be alive because we have obese people that are, quote, in poverty. That has never happened any other time in human history. Would you have people living in poverty that are morbidly obese?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some nuance here. Besides looking at just like the real nutritional value of the food that's coming out of the commodity systems and the quote unquote conventional agriculture, um, there's also like what 60 years. I think there's the forecast that it conventional cropping systems will completely cease to function 60 years from now, no matter how much chemicals you put into it and how many bioengineered products and whatever. There's just not enough life left in the soil to continue going the way we're going. Like saying that conventional agriculture feeds the world, it's like when it's not currently producing the nutritional value people need, and past one lifetime from now, it won't function at all. How can you ask the question, but can it feed the world, implying that conventional agriculture does? Also, like, you know, what you were saying earlier, I almost want to get away from conventional. Like, let's talk from like extractive agriculture that is just pulling things out of a system versus less extractive or sustainable or regenerative agriculture, which is kind of living off of the surplus, right? Like living off the interest instead of the principle. Um, that on every way you look at it is more productive, more efficient, like on both a total yield per acre, like it's hard to find examples that hold up because it takes decades of good management to be able to demonstrate this. But like you see it. One straw revolution, Fukuoka was like a Japanese farmer that practiced dryland grass farm, rice farming in Japan with like integrated animals pooping in it in orchards, and his farm produces as much or more rice than the conventional rice paddies with all the fertilizers and everything. So like saying that you can't produce the same amount using regenerative practices is not true. It's just harder. It takes longer. It takes more management inputs. And then if you want to like really get crazy about it, look at how much food you can produce on a quarter acre with a bunch of people who know what they're doing. You know,
Yeah.
China sustained population levels way beyond what we're dealing with for a very long time using or like totally organic regenerative agricultural methods. Like there you can absolutely feed the world using non-extractive agricultural methods. Like it's the only way you can feed the world ultimately long term. So let's get rid of this myth that conventional agriculture, especially when half the food that is coming out of those systems gets either burned or thrown away.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And like I said earlier, I'm not I should actually probably be, worth what I'm saying and go find this research and read it so I know what I'm talking about. But I'm pretty sure that I've seen it said that small scale sustainable agriculture is responsible for between 75 and 80% of the world's calories and nutrients. And
Yeah.
I believe that.
I bet
definitely,
it's changing rapidly. I bet that number changes like 5% a year or something. But
and that's entirely possible. My argument is industrialized extractive food systems have never fed the world and will never feed the world because the energy is not there. The synthetic energy is not there to manufacture the synthetic fertility, to transport it.
yeah, I mean, you can produce nitrogen. Like Haber-Bosch process is pretty amazing. But like you can't grow food just with nitrogen. Like you need phosphorus at least, and the phosphorus is coming out of a mine that's like rapidly, getting tapped out. And that doesn't even go into the 12 other things that are part of the sort of biological cycles which create the fertility that we need to grow the food. Like, nobody's talking about boron and all the other things that I'm just now starting to learn about, but won't
If
try
we
to nerd
weren't
out too hard on.
mining phosphate from the ground, we'd be digging up bad shit in caves because that's the other natural sort of phosphate of phosphate is
But why
batch.
can't we just get all the chickens out of cages on concrete floors and out into the fields? You know, chickens produce it naturally. You give them grass or grain or whatever, they poop it out.
Zach, I get it. I mean, I get it. It makes
And I
sense
think
to
I
me.
think enough. I think a lot of people do. I think we're at a point where like even the diehard old guys that really are bought into the system, it might have really serious challenges being able to actually make this transition because like they have the reality that they've got a $2 million interest payment on their land and their fertilizer and their operating loans and their $5 million worth of equipment and blah 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 blah. Even those guys are like, oh yeah, uh, this isn't really working anymore. The federal government's even starting to be like, okay, we gotta get away from this strictly commodity based thing. Like when we're starting to see 40% of the Iowa grain crop going out in one gust of wind, like the derechos, like the drought that has been racking everybody. Um, I think that there is the buildup of sort of communal consciousness around how screwed we are and how imperative it is that we change the way that we do things is reaching a point. And what we need is like, I think what we need is a is a narrative about how to create that change that isn't like that doesn't just disintegrate in like the damn Democrats trying to ruin our traditions and make us all drag queen baby killing whatever. It's like, come on, guys, like let's come up with a different story to tell each other about what we're doing here, and make it something like I think the extreme right and the extreme left are going to come full circle around and shake hands at some point, and all the guys in the middle are going to be like, "Whoa, what's going on here?" Like the meat processing thing, you know, like we get a lot of vegans that come into our shop.
Really? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, people appreciate that what we're doing is not industrial meat, and what they're opposed to isn't necessarily meat. We don't get any like hardcore militant vegans that are like, the Pause Act Colorado sort of folks that are like, don't preg check the animals, like that sort of nonsense. It's people who have a really strong ethic around their food and don't want animals to be separated from the land and abused and exploited, and like think that industrial meat is evil, which like I'm trying to not alienate every pig farmer in the country by being like, if you run a cattle, you're evil. But like, you're working for an entity that like doesn't care about anything besides money and is like externalizing costs onto you, onto your animals, onto the water, onto the communities. We concentrate the everything in a way that just like guts rural communities. And like people in rural communities are feeling that. And right now you're seeing that come out in populism. This is when the rural communities, the people in the middle at the bottom get really squeezed, they react. And if you give them an outlet that is some charismatic leader saying, I'm here to save you, that
We're
that's
going to
how
build
you
it back better. Oh, wait, that's this guy. The other guy was Make America Great Again. It's the same term. I mean, it's the same exact phrase.
But if we can create something that says, both of these, pot like factions are just two sides of the same shitty coin, and we need a real like alternative that is not just going to talk about guns and abortion and is going to start talking about food sovereignty and
soil and nutrition,
soil health, nutrition, and like stop trying to, if we had a party that wasn't saying we need to socialize medicine so that we can control which corporations get paid off of the pandemic levels of obesity and preventable diseases being caused by a poisoned food system, and had somebody saying we need to fix the food system, like we need laws that are set up in a way where the giant corporations get appropriately regulated in a way that ensures food safety, that those regulations are separate from the small regional scale, in-state or like interstate but less huge commodity. And those should probably be different than like, it makes no sense that if I want to kill 4 hogs, a week on my farm that I have to check off all the same boxes that a Chinese owned corporation that controls half of the global pork supply has to check off to be able to run a plant that processes 40,000 hogs a day. Like, that's ridiculous, you know? Um, so,
Because,
like,
well, just knowing how people operate versus how an individual operates a business they care about versus how an employee works for a big company. Yeah, you're doing 4 a week. They're doing 10,000 a day. Labor requirements like man hours per pounds of meat to the cooler, you're probably doing just as good as they are. But you're also wearing all 17 hats at your processing plant, right? You're not just making one cut as that carcass comes screaming by on a chain at a speed of 10,000 per day, right?
no, you can't train a whole animal butcher in 10 minutes like you can a, you know, refugee, indentured servant, essentially, like, which is mostly what works at these big meat plants. Um, it is a real problem. I mean, and that's where everybody comes back to the efficiency thing, right? Well, this is more efficient, therefore it's less costly, and therefore it's better for people because they don't have to spend as much of their hard-earned dollar on food. But in reality, like, CAFOs are the least efficient food production method ever devised in all of human history. I mean, the amount of energy that goes into a pound of feedlot beef is hundreds of times the amount of energy actually embodied in the beef. You know, like, I think when we're if we raise an animal primarily either on perennial grasses that are already growing, or, you know, in our case, byproducts of producing things that everybody wants, like bread, beer, whiskey, you know, the inevitable excess that comes with the fact that matching production to consumption all the time perfectly is not a good idea. And being under the demand for consumption, when it comes to your production, means people go hungry. So there's always going to be some waste, but it doesn't have to be waste if you're recycling it, keeping the nutrients like going back into the ground, and using it as an offset for the synthetic fertilizers that don't have the positive long-term impacts that like biological fertilizers do. So I got off a real squirrel trail there. I can't even remember where I was trying to get to.
I don't either. I was just enjoying listening to you talk. Circling back, like, and I've wanted to make this comment now for several minutes. You were talking about the meat police, the FSIS guys. Now,
Yeah.
it from what I've been told, now I don't have any personal touch points with that organization, is they're not going to volunteer any information or any answers, and they really can't. But if you know the right questions to ask, that they can be an absolute just cornucopia of information. Is that pretty true?
Um, yeah, I think that there's a lot of politics around it and whatnot. I mean, I like not gonna name any names or anything because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But like, you know, some of the folks that we've talked to are, you know, a little bit, maybe a little bit reticent. Like, you could tell that they were definitely not supposed to be going around sharing this stuff. But we like, I met the guy and met him at a farmer's market while I was selling some meat that wasn't appropriately labeled. Uh, and I won't go too much into that, but got a little bit of a slap on the wrist. I met him and I sold him some sausage, and he came back a week later with his USDA FSIS badge on, and some of his
Oh shit!
associates. And, you know,
What was that like?
I I had to go change my shorts afterwards, but like, it was actually, you know, he came up and said, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that these are the requirements for the retail sale of meat. And it's important that everybody abide by these. And like, it was the softest little slap on the wrist I'd ever gotten. And like, the meat was actually, that animal had been harvested at a USDA plant. I didn't realize it at the time, but what we were doing, if we'd had the appropriate labels, would have been legal. I thought that what I was doing was illegal, but um, subsequent conversations with the guy, I was like, how can we operate this business? Because these are the problems we're running into. And he printed out it's got a ridiculous name. It's like the Food Safety Inspection Services Guide for Knowing When Protein Sources, including animal meat, are or are not subject to federal and or state exemption. Like that's the name of the pamphlet, but
They
it's like a
probably
20.
have an internal acronym for that that's hilarious.
Yeah, probably. But he printed it out and like met us at a coffee shop and went through it with us. And he had circled the things that he was like, this is probably going to be your best bet. Um, and, at that point, we were 3-4 years into it, and nobody had ever told us that there's something called a retail exemption. As long as an animal is harvested at a federally or state inspected plant, well, we'll stick with federal. If an animal gets harvested at a federal plant, once it gets stamped and the carcass goes out the door, the feds don't care anymore. They recommend that you abide by state and local regulations. But as far as the feds are concerned, if you get an animal slaughtered at a USDA plant, you cut it up in your garage and sell it by the pound.
But can you mark those packages USDA?
No, you can't wholesale. So the retail exemption says that as long as you're going direct to consumer, and then there's another little loophole that says you can do up to $75,000 per year, or no, 25% of your gross sales not to exceed $75,000 per year can go to hotels, restaurants, or institutions. I was like, wait, so we don't need inspection for the processing as long as we get the animals slaughtered under inspection? So that was the seed that grew into dialing in on where local plants that are already maxed out beyond capacity, because there's only 3 of them in the whole state and there's millions of animals. Their bottleneck is not on the slaughter floor; it's on fabrication. It takes a skilled slaughterman can process an entire beef from live animal into hanging carcass in an hour. There are no skilled butchers that can turn a whole beef from a carcass into a bunch of packages in an hour. It takes like 6 guys half a day.
Yeah.
So the slaughter floor like sits empty the majority of the time. So we went and said, well, we can do our own processing. Can we bring animals just for slaughter? And they're like, wait, so we can get paid $500 to have the slaughter guy put an extra half day's work in and you pick up the carcasses the next day? Yeah, sure. And then it wasn't like our original business model involved doing all of our own processing. But by virtue of that was the option available, we started doing our own butchering. And then you come and find out that part of the reason that, the small guys get smoked is not just the efficiency of the processing, but it's all the variety of the processing. Like we get a hog back when we were taking it to a plant that processed it all for us, you get 40% back. And, just chops and roasts and grind.
Where are my bones? Where are my innards?
We get a whole carcass back. All of a sudden, like we're rendering the fat and selling it as cooking oil for $10 a pound. And then, so the 20 pounds of fat off of your nice, well marbled hogs, that's $200 off of the carcass value. You take that 30 pounds of bones and, it takes like 6-7 pounds, 5 to 7 pounds of bones and put it in a crock pot with some carrots and onions and whatnot and leave it there boiling while you're breaking down the next hog. And then you sell bone broth at $15 a quart. 5 pounds makes a gallon. That's $60 for a 5-pound bag of bones. And you get 20-30 pounds of bones off of it. It's another $200-300. We used to, the average, just to put this in perspective, your average commodity hog farmer gets about between $20 and $30 profit off of a hog.
Sounds about right.
So this is where, like, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, I don't think that, and it doesn't make sense for somebody who lives in rural Iowa and is trying to make a living producing food to say, you should take your 2,500 head hog production and convert to the model that we have. Like, we've got 20 sows. We don't run them very hard. We're finishing maybe 150 hogs a year. It's very, very small. But the amount of food waste we're diverting, the amount of compost we're producing, the amount of value that we can get out of the carcasses by being more vertically integrated, the value that comes to the surrounding agricultural community by us creating a space that was originally intended just for us to sell our product, now services dozens and dozens and hundreds of other producers. So like, saying, hey guys, why don't you think about like maybe you are contracted with Smithfield and you're shipping hogs out there. Maybe a few of them you should try to sell to a local butcher shop. Maybe you guys should think about like seeing if some of the other hog farmers in the area want to invest in a small, a small abattoir that could just do the slaughter so that people who want to, who have grocery stores or want to start a butcher shop, or restaurants who want to, do whole animal utilization can get access to that market. And maybe it's not the whole model, but like, can we start thinking about how we can shorten those supply chains and not be so concerned with shipping hogs to China, and think more about like, how can we get more of the retail dollars in our community going back into local agricultural operations? Or on the land management side of it, how can we like, just get hog farmers to source local feed, like stop buying the soy from the next state over and start thinking about supporting some non-GMO, small family farm in your local area who's practicing regenerative practices, and see if you can get some increased value on the market for your hogs just by being able to represent to the consumers that like, you're investing in soil health, you're investing in local community, and you're investing in things that like, everybody's into. And like, if we can get some of those bigger guys to stop, thinking of us as competition and as a threat, and start looking at how they can adopt what we're doing into their practices in a way that makes sense for them and benefits them. And then vice versa, like if we can look at what the big guys are doing, like whole animal utilization, it's a great example. Part of the reason meat is so cheap coming out of these high-speed kill plants is that they pay for all of the inputs selling the stuff that isn't meat. So like, how can we figure out how to stop sending all of our offal and all of our fat and all of the other parts of the animal to the landfill, and start reclaiming that and using that as like an economic driver to make us more competitive so that we can operate sustainable businesses that don't just cater to people who want to spend a bunch of money as a status symbol. How can we actually reduce the cost for regeneratively raised food to the point where somebody in the current economic reality can buy food from somebody in their community that is healthy, that is going to sustain them, and also allow them to make their car payments and make their house payment and be able to still like take their kids on vacation once a year. That's the challenge that I'm like really excited about right now. So it's also a daunting one, but
we've got a lot of work to do, don't we? Like
we got to do it really fast.
I worry that we're not doing it fast enough, but I think we're doing it as fast as we can.
Well, I think a lot about, history. I was more into history growing up and theories of change around like revolution. And it's always funny, like, in I think 1765, you wouldn't have been able to find one person out of 100 who said that separating from England was a good idea in this country. 10 years later,
that's probably a pretty fair point.
1992, you could not find a diplomat, an academic, a politician, or anybody with any concern about being perceived as a crazy person who said that apartheid was 2 years away from ending. Everybody said apartheid in South Africa would last till at least 2050. That's how long it was going to take before white rule in South Africa ended. That was the global consensus in 1992. Apartheid ended in 1994.
And in
Like there's a
1994, we didn't have any idea the Berlin Wall was about to come down either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was 10, 20 years off. And then actually, no, it's 2 weeks next week. And like,
Well,
I think we're
okay.
building towards that moment. And I'm excited about it. It's a cool time to be involved in this because, what's the first they ignore you and then they
Ridicule.
ridicule you and laugh at you. And then they fight you and then you win. Like, I think we've moved past the they ignore you stage. And
Yes.
I think we're getting past the they ridicule you stage. And right now what I'm feeling is like they're fighting hard and they're scared.
Okay.
And the more that you get, especially people who are really bought into the system and that are never gonna, you know, talk about the spiritual connection between the soil and like your gut biome and like are just, sort of dollars and cents sort of guys, the more those guys are like, no, we're growing cover crops and we want to graze animals and we're setting up slaughterhouses and screw you guys. The more we can get the the old boys to stop thinking of us as a threat and start thinking of us as the tip of the spear that they get to follow into a less shitty universe. Like I think then we're really gonna see people quaking in their boots and the change. It's not complicated either. There's 10 different ways to solve the problem. Any one of them, you could just sign a bill, bam, give it 2-3 years. Like the transition starts happening. It takes some transition, but like the problems aren't even that hard. Even like my problem with the water, like we're 20 years away from running out of water. If we could reduce the center pivot irrigation by X amount, which if 1% soil carbon increases water absorption capacity by 20 to 30,000 gallons. If you increase the soil carbon on all of the center pivots in the Estancia Valley by 5 points, which you can do using cover cropping, soil amendments, biochar, good management, like that reduces the demand on water by, you know,
A
like
lot.
we need to cut 90% out of our groundwater pumping. Sounds crazy. Composting toilets, 30%. Changes in like the way we use agricultural water. Another easy like 40-50%. Water conservation in household use, out of a ban. Forest health, like the fault lines tend to be where you get elevation changes, which is also where you get trees. Forests haven't been thinned. We thin and burn the forest. Like the well my parents are on, they're up closer to the forest. They did thinned and burned up the drainage from them. They saw a 60-foot increase in their well in 1 year. Largest ever recorded increase in this area in the last 30 years.
Wait. You mean when we get rid of some of these trees that have been allowed to grow since we interrupted the natural fire pattern, that our creeks will come back and our aquifers will refill?
We can make it happen. It's not quite that simple, but like huge positive impacts from like, if you get the federal government to be like the same thing we are talking about with ownership being not just entitlement to extraction, but being coming with responsibilities for stewardship. Federal government claims jurisdiction over our land, won't let us on there to cut firewood, won't let people in there to log it, heavily regulate even the hunting, don't do shit to maintain it, interrupt the fire cycles, interrupt all the things that like allow nature to maintain its own equilibrium. Like it takes an intervention at this point because if there's a fire, it will be devastating. But like if we can get the federal government to stop sending billions of dollars to other people to kill women and
Other
children
people.
and start like doing their job and maintaining, stewarding the lands that they claim ownership over, like then that can be another high increase in the amount of water going back into the aquifer systems. Then it just comes down to like distribution and governance. Big fight that I'm in right now is with the we purchased a warehouse building adjacent to our retail site to expand to try to start doing like regional scale sort of processing. So we get out of our 400 square foot kitchen. People we bought it from, it seemed like a neighborly, handshake sort of deal. Like they needed to sell to stay solvent and we needed to move in to be able to have the deed so we could get the grants to yada yada. Got screwed on the deal. And the reason we got screwed on the deal is because one of the only potable water resources for the community for people whose wells run dry is on an adjacent lot. So they took away our access to the building so that they could control access to one of the few places that you can go and get potable water if your well runs dry. And that got approved by the county government. And I'm not sure if the county government was trying to support this effort to privatize community water resources, or if they were just trying to undermine our ability to start a meat processing plant in their suburban little haven because they didn't want to have to deal with that. But either way, it brings up the, real pressing question of like, what are people's rights when it comes to access to healthy food, to potable water?
Yeah. And
water doesn't come from a pipe and food doesn't come from the store.
You're not entitled to the fruits of another person's labor. So like I don't see an entitlement to food. Do you have an entitlement to air? I'm not going to take it away from you. Do you have an entitlement to clean water? If you go get it, go for it. I'm not going to screw those things up for you. Well, that's also what I'm saying. But there's, when you start talking about that, and I'm not saying you specifically, okay?
Yeah.
But people start saying food is a human right. It's the same thing as saying healthcare is a human right, which means there's an outside entity that's going to compel me to give you my labor for free or to reduce cost. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But on the flip side, we don't have a society that affords everyone the opportunity to grow food. Not everyone has a place or an opportunity to be able to do that. And I'm not saying that people can't go find that if they're resourceful. I mean, probably they absolutely can. But by and large, it's not in front of everybody. Like, there's not community gardens everywhere that people are walking by 10 times a day. You don't see advertisements for community food programs on CNN, right? That's not their narrative at all. But yeah, I'm rambling, and we have run a little long, sir.
Oh, it's been a really fun conversation.
I've really enjoyed it, and I don't think I made a few notes, and I didn't really get to any of it, so we'll have to do another one sometime.
Anytime.
How would you like to end?
Trying to think of a real zippy sign off, and I just don't have one. So I'll just say thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting. I'd love to continue the conversation. If you ever have a gap in your schedule, feel free to hit me up.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again sometime. And don't feel bad about on the spot about not having any closing thoughts. Sometimes I can't come up with a snappy one-liner, even when I've been thinking about it for 2 hours.
There you go.
All right, we're going to end. Have a good week, guys. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our podcast. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a review if you haven't already. And don't forget to check out the Q&A and the polls on Spotify. Your support helps us bring more enlightening conversations and fresh stories from the world of farming and ranching. Thank you for listening to Ranching Reboot, your favorite regenerative ag podcast.